Welcome, weary traveler. This is Mara and Ben, and we're inviting you to have a seat by the fire and have some of our delicious home brew. Today we'll be discussing making homebrew playable races, classes, and even your own homebrew campaign settings.
Yes, now, there are many different kinds of homebrew, and we'll try to cover as many of them as we can within reasonable limits. But what I'd like to start out with today is races and classes homebrew. I have actually developed quite a few of these, none of which are up, well, okay, one of which is up for public consumption, of which I will link in the description below, and it might appear on screen right now. But it is the Pixie race, which I used a GNOME template to make effectively. They're very basic. And so it was a very insightful and interesting experience, but overall what I'd say about that was I learned just how hard it is to balance an ability correctly. My flying speed for the Pixie was incredibly difficult to master because they have a flying speed of 30, which I figured that the tiny size and the strength debuff I gave them would sort of balance it out, but even then, having 30 movement speed, that can be pretty 30 flying movement speed that is not affected by traps or anything, that's pretty overpowered in a game about dungeons. So it was quite a challenge, but overall, I'd say that if you can get the balance right, you can do almost anything with races or classes. If you want a entire race that is literally just made out of steak that has been stapled together and is now a flesh golem, that is a thing which you can do if you figure out how to make it work, and I will let Ben carry it out from there.
So, an example that I was interested in for a homebrew race would be something that was half elf and half orc. And those who are purists with the lore will argue that, well, orcs specifically do not mate with elves because the hatred for the races, between the races, is so deep. And I will say, haha, I am nerdier than you because I have read enough of the lore to know that orcs and drow elves actually do interact on a routine basis. So it makes a certain amount of sense that there might be half drow and half orcs running around somewhere in the Underdark. Now, there is a template on the D&D Wiki homebrew page for how to do an elf-orc, and the way it says is you choose 3 of the following possible traits. The aggressive, it's basically, without going into the whole thing, it's basically a whole list of the possible traits of elves, half-orcs, and orcs. So you've got like 9 things you can choose from here. None of those things are necessarily overpowered on their own, but the reason why I feel this is flawed is because having that list to choose from allows you to sort of break the race. What I would recommend if you were going to do something like this, which I almost certainly will at some point, would be to choose a couple and that's what you get. So what I would say for these is probably Fey Ancestry, because all creatures with Fey Ancestry get those traits, the resistance to being charmed and immunity to being put to sleep magically. Probably the Relentless Endurance, because that's just an iconic half-orc trait. Dark Vision, definitely, because both parents have it. And actually what I would do is I would give them a trait that is just specific to them. I would have it be something related to their stealth ability. There's an orc god called Shargus that is a god of rogues and assassins, not as commonly worshipped as Grumish, and his followers are not nearly as well known, revered, or feared, but that would be the logical sort of mating for a drow elf. That could be a really interesting setup for a character.
Yeah, something that I've seen this especially on the D&D wiki, but something that people don't necessarily understand and at the risk of talking a bit too technical for a game about dragons, is that you need to keep in mind what are dominant and recessive traits here. Race abilities which you do not see outside of very specific races are probably not going to get transferred over to your half whatever it is. You know, there's a reason why if you play half drow, half human, you don't get the drow's magical abilities. That is an innately recessive trait unique to the drow. Things like that, which, again, a bit scientific, but I've seen too many half whatever races, like half Tarrasque is a homebrew thing I saw once, and it's just like, no legendary action, thank you. That's unique to those guys. So
Yes, and I do believe that when you do a half race or even a homebrew class, it's really important to resist the urge to make it just completely sick broken. As Mara was saying, having a pixie race that gets around mostly by flying can be extremely broken. Now, if you interact with your DM before you break this out, then you give the DM a chance to make a world that makes sense where that ability is not so broken. Speaking of the worlds, I'd like to go on to discuss how homebrew world building works. I tend to do almost exclusively homebrew campaign settings. It's just a matter of my personal preference. Some things that I have learned that really make the difference when you're doing this is don't focus on the J.R.R. Tolkien levels of detail behind your world. Realistically, it's not going to matter very much. What's more important is to have a couple of little details that set up the campaign, set up the place where this campaign is happening. There's a great scene in the movie Pulp Fiction where somebody's just gotten back from Europe and he's talking about the differences in Europe and how it's the little things. McDonald's used to be a thing in Europe, and McDonald's iconic sandwich, or one of them in America, was the Quarter Pounder with cheese. But where he was in Europe, they called it Le Royale because Europe doesn't use Europe uses the metric system. So just that little bit of difference can make a huge, huge statement about where you are and what it's like. So as you set up your homebrew world, think a little bit about what races are going to be most common. What superstitions do people have? How is a level 5 character going to be perceived? If you think about it, if you're the sheriff of a town in a standard D&D world and a party of adventurers pull up, what is that sheriff going to do? Is it going to be a situation where they're going to be welcomed into the village as visiting heroes, or is it going to be, you can stop at the provision store and then I want you out of town. We don't need your kind here. You guys are nothing but trouble.
yes, and to expand upon those little details a bit, I would also recommend, especially for cities, but just for the world in general, add a few things which make it especially unique, you know? The DM who we've referenced as Charlie in the past, I believe, his first campaign took place in a massive city. And on top of the other issues I had with that campaign, it felt like wandering through New York City. It was literally just medieval New York City. And I've played in one too many campaigns, which is 3, but still, I've played in too many campaigns where that is the case, is whatever your city is just sort of the parallel in D&D of an existing city or culture or whatever it is, and to an extent that can be fun and interesting, but at the same time, if it's done so repeatedly throughout the entirety of the community, that realistically we do need DMs to invent a language occasionally, or come up with a special, unique racial trait for all of their humans, or whatever it is. You know, there needs to be something special, that little spark of something greater.
Yes, and the way I did that, actually, in my first homebrew world, was I modeled it on a time period in ancient history called the Late Bronze Age collapse. I'm not going to bore anybody who's listening with a great deal of historical detail about it. What was important about it, though, is that most people aren't that familiar with that time period in history, so the world didn't have the same familiarity to it as this is just magical Los Angeles or this is just magical New York. And it allowed me to have a template where I could start from and then change. And also, I'd like to point out, since none of those cultures that were included in the campaign or that really existed at that time are still living cultures today, there weren't some of the possible issues with stereotyping, racial sensitivities, etc., etc.
Yes, now, moving on to our next point, though, I will say that is definitely true, is just like, for example, you could also do, like, ancient Mesopotamia. It's completely different from modern times. No one would expect it. But yeah, on to our next point. Some of the new classes and races, I feel, are just, in the D&D books, not homebrew, feel like homebrew in some of the worst ways. While I love Xanathars, I truly do, it is overpowered. That is just a fact of it. Well, it's good that they buffed Rangers, they also buffed everything else. Like, now half of the classes can be a better cleric than the cleric. On top of that, going into subclasses a bit, there in Mordekainen's guide especially, this is a great example of it, there are now 9 tiefling variants overall, I believe. Not all of them are included in what I'm looking at here, I don't think. Probably because they're very small things. Oh, nope, they are all here. Okay, and now, I'm not going to get into every single one of these 9's abilities. They're basically just based on different aspects of the Demon Lords, I believe, or possibly the Abyssal Lords. But the problem here is that there are now more Tiefling variants than there are Elves, which Elves are everywhere. I will not get into my dislike of how common they have become, but Elves are literally everywhere. They're on every single plane, and there is a unique variant of them on every single plane. So the fact that there are now more Tiefling subtypes than Elves really shows a problem here. And the last thing I'll really say before I sort of pass it over to Ben again is that on top of all of this, there are certain... The Artificer especially... It's very clear that they did what I did with the Pixie class, which is they watched something and then decided, oh, well, that should be in the game now. And with the Artificer, what I'm specifically thinking of is the Alchemist subclass. Because for the Artificer, sounds fairly normal. The Alchemist, however, all of their magic is described as ritualistic, and it takes time to practice it, and it consumes a spell slot, which sounds almost exactly like the alchemy in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. So it's clearly one of the developers watched that and said, hey, none of my colleagues have watched that, so if I just sneak this system into the game, no one's going to notice.
Yes, and with the expansion of the Tieflings, I do have a little bit mixed feelings about it. I'm all for there being a little more variation in the kind of Tiefling, because it does make sense that your Tiefling would be different if they were a Tiefling with infernal heritage or abyssal heritage from the Nine Hells or heritage from the Abyss. However, having so many variants of it gets confusing, it gets hard to keep track of, and it's just kind of pointless. And also, part of the deal with Tieflings in general is they're supposed to be exceedingly rare, whereas Elves are not. Elves are the opposite. They're one of those, as Mara said, perennial races, sort of like Dwarves or Goblins, where they're just sort of everywhere. So it doesn't make sense for them to have sort of gone so overboard with varying the Tieflings. Now, as far as how I feel about Homebrew in general, Homebrew I think is actually a beautiful thing. I think Homebrew in a lot of ways is what makes this game go. When you do something like make a Halfling Barbarian, in a way that's your own version of Homebrew. Halflings weren't really designed to be barbarians as the creators designed them. So you're doing your own special thing. So as long as the DM is okay with it, as long as the other players at the table are okay with it, I say do your homebrew and just have loads of fun with it. We say this on every one, but this one especially. I'm really interested to hear what our viewers have to say about Homebrew, and specifically what Homebrew races, classes, and worlds they've created, what those look like, and what your experience was. How did it work out for you? So, as always, if you've made it this far, please like, subscribe. Thank you so much for your likes and views up to this point. It's been a great project. We're looking forward to doing more. And take it away, Mara.
Oh, yes. So, as mentioned, like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. On top of that, our next video is going to be about table etiquette and expectations, a subject which both of us don't believe is really covered enough. And finally, the last thing I want to mention is if you were in any way curious about that whole Bronze Age collapse thing that Ben mentioned, we'll be having a new channel about history, topics up hopefully within the next week or two. So you might get to hear about that very soon. If we do, I'll be sure to leave a link in the description below when that's up. So again, thank you for watching. See you next time.